that because it's roughly modern-day Senegal, Gambia. I mentioned this one first because it is the one that has one of the biggest impacts here in Louisiana. Back during the French colonial period, this is the region where most of the enslaved people came from. Probably 2/3. Now, another area I want to talk about is here, the Bight of Benin. And literally the Bight is this right here. It's this formation on the ocean. But for purposes of today, we're talking about this whole region here. Bight of Benin is also very important to Louisiana because during that French colonial period, that was the second main area that people came from. You had about close to 2/3 come from Senegambia. About the other third came from the Bight of Benin. Now, people from the Bight of Benin were present elsewhere in the Americas. They were present in Georgia, South Carolina, for instance, but not in the numbers they were during French colonial Louisiana. Now, the Bight of Biafra, this area right here, that's a third major area. Now, when we talk about Louisiana, there weren't a lot of enslaved people coming from the Bight of Biafra. There were some, but not a lot. Where you saw these people primarily would be in Virginia and Maryland. Virginia and Maryland, at least a good 40% were coming from this area. Maybe a majority, a lot of people would say a majority of people in that region, kind of the upper Atlantic South, come from here. Now, looking down at West Central Africa, you notice there's a big separation here. It's a long way from Senegambia. We're talking 1,000-something miles between these two, to tell you just about the distance between them. This area here, West Central Africa, has really not been paid a lot of attention to until recently. But when you look at it, it's the area of Africa that more people came from probably than all the others combined when we're talking about what becomes the United States. Generally not paid much attention to, but if you look at it, in Louisiana, probably a majority of all people who were enslaved and brought to Louisiana came from here. Now, you might have noticed I talked about during the French colonial period, people were coming from Senegambia first, Bight of Benin second. Well, when the Spanish take over, it shifts entirely. The Spanish import a lot more slaves than the French ever did, and they bring them from here. They force them into slavery from this area. And they are an absolute numerical majority in Louisiana, almost certainly. In fact, across the entire United States and the colonies before it, they were the numerical majority, almost certainly. In fact, the only place that they weren't really the majority was going to be Virginia, Maryland area. There, they were probably the second biggest group after people from the Bight of Biafra. So those are where people were coming from. What I'd like to do now is say a little bit about why these people, and I hate to say contributors because that makes it sound like it's a good thing, but it's not. It's slavery, it's enslavement of people and sending them against their will overseas. So don't get the wrong impression if I say contributor. It doesn't mean a good thing in this case. But looking back at Senegambia, why did so many people come, especially to Louisiana, from here? Well, it's the timing of it. France founds the Louisiana colony right at the end of the 1600s, moving into the 1700s, and they're looking for people to work plantations. So, like sadly many others had done before them, they turned to Africa and slavery. There are a lot of people available to be bought and sold here in Senegambia. The reason is you have people kind of moving down out of the north, especially the Fulani, the Fulbe. They're more or less the same group. The Fulani Fulbe herdsmen are Islamic. They're invading down into Senegambia. The people living there, by and large, were not Islamic. So what you're seeing is Islamic holy wars, jihads against the non-Islamic peoples of Senegambia. Now, what that means is sometimes one side wins, sometimes the other side wins. The loser usually finds themselves imprisoned, or at least a lot of their soldiers in prison, and they find themselves being sold off into slavery when Europeans come along the coast looking to buy slaves. Now, other than that, though, there is more than just the slave trade to Senegambia. If we're going to look at this region, what it looks like, and tell you what, I don't guess I need to share the screen anymore. Let me take that off. What you would see if you were to go back 1700s or before, this is the area that would be associated the most with these large empires, major kingdoms. You have a succession of empires in Senegambia. The Empire of Ghana, the Empire of Old Mali, and the Songhai Empire, each one bigger than the last. These are huge things. In fact, the history of the area is more like what we might associate with, say, European history if you're reading the textbooks that pay so much attention to the kingdoms of Europe. This has those kind of large nations, these large empires even there. And people don't pay that much attention to them, but they should. Now, moving over to the Bight of Benin, that's just, and the way I'm looking at it, I'm just moving down across Africa from the farthest to the lowest. Bight of Benin, this area does not have these big empires. It tends to have smaller countries, smaller kingdoms, and then also sometimes not necessarily even kingdoms, but just groups, people groups. Now, probably the single most important kingdom so far as power, prestige goes in that area is what was called Dahomey. Now, Dahomey at its furthest extent is basically the modern day country of Benin. So it's not huge, but it's the size of a country. When Europeans are kind of going along that coast and they're engaging in the slave trade, Dahomey was a relatively small kingdom in the interior. But right after 1700, a particular king named King Agaja rose to power, inherited the throne, and he decided he wanted a part of the slave trade. So what he set about doing in the 1720s was invading his neighbors to the south. Along the seacoast, you had a lot of very small, relatively weak city-states, the most important of which was one called Ouida. Now, the modern-day city of Ouida, it's still there. You can visit it. Ouida was an independent city-state. King Agaja conquered it. The reason he went for it is it was already a major slave trading port. He wanted to control it so he could have access to the European slave trade. He conquered the city. He was not a guy that you really wanted to be conquered by. He was rather brutal to the city. A lot of people were killed in the process. A lot of others were sold into slavery right then and there. Some were sold to Europeans. He took a lot back to his capital because he also had his own plantation system. And he put a lot of people into slavery working his plantations for him. But many others he sold to Europeans. Now, I mention that in particular because if we look at the history of Louisiana, that very time period is when you see people being sent over from the Bight of Benin. You see enslaved people who were enslaved by King Agaja, sold into slavery, coming from the city of Ouida and some of the other cities along the coast. They end up in Louisiana. So you can see exactly where they came from. A very traumatic experience for a lot of reasons. Now, looking a little further on, going over to the Bight of Biafra. Bight of Biafra, somewhat similar to what you would see in the Bight of Benin. A lot of smaller kingdoms. Now, there are a lot of people that can be classified as what we today would call Yoruba. Now, Yoruba is kind of a broad term. It's a relatively recent creation. It's kind of created by your ethnographers and anthropologists to describe more or less what we might call an ethnic group. There were several different independent not Maya, I'm thinking of the comparison between Mayas and Yorubas in my head here when I'm trying to talk. Sorry about that. But the Yoruba, there are several independent kingdoms. They weren't really ever one big kingdom, but you had several kingdoms. They were there. You also had the Igbo. The Igbo didn't really have kingdoms very often. They were also like an ethnic group, but usually just had more of a village organization. So they lived in their villages. They weren't organized into a nation, which unfortunately meant they were the easy ones to attack. The Yoruba could raid into Igbo villages relatively easily without as much resistance. That's why a lot of Igbo people ended up being sold into slavery, ended up in places like Virginia and Maryland. There aren't many Yorubas. The Yoruba influence in North America is pretty small, pretty minor. People talk about them a lot. There are a lot of articles about them, but they really aren't very influential here. They are in Cuba, they are in Brazil, not so much in North America. Now, the last area, that West Central Africa, that's the one further down the coast, like I mentioned. I guess you're looking at it would be down on the longer part of Africa coming down. West Central Africa, like I mentioned, is one of these areas you really didn't hear much about until fairly recently. In about the last 20, 25 years, a lot of historians, a lot of scholars have gone back and started digging into the sources, and they've realized that West Central Africa was really, really important. If you go back and look at older things, people emphasize places like, again, Yoruba land, or they might emphasize Ghana, which hardly any slaves were coming from Ghana to North America. You just don't see that. You see instead West Central Africa, and it's kind of been rediscovered. as an area that really suffered from the slave trade. Now, I want to say a little bit more about it because it is something that so few people have really encountered, unless you're like a historian who studies this area and has read the latest scholarly stuff. You might not have heard of it. Well, it's got its own unique history as well. It tends to have some kingdoms, some pretty big, pretty powerful kingdoms. Maybe not the Songhai Empire or Old Mali, but more important than, say, Dahomey or some of the Yoruba kingdoms. In particular, it had the Kingdom of Congo. The Kingdom of Congo was right there, kind of on the border between the two Congos and Angola, along the Congo River. No one knows really when it was founded, but you can safely say sometime in the Middle Ages, at least, it was around. It first got written down and encountered by Europeans by the Portuguese. The Portuguese were sailing down the coast of Africa trying to get to India and the spice trade. They happened to stop there. They encountered a king of this great kingdom in 1483, and they became good friends. The Portuguese, the people of the Congo, worked together strongly for quite a while. In fact, the king of the Congo was so impressed by the Portuguese, in particular, he was very impressed by Christianity, converted to Christianity 2 years later, 1485. He became a Christian. He took the name, and let me make sure I'm getting the right one here, João the First. It was like Joseph the First. And he set about trying to convert his entire kingdom to Roman Catholicism. He adopted European names for his nobles. He set up more or less a European feudal system within his country. And for quite a while, the Portuguese and the Kingdom of Congo got along. But as you could probably figure out, that's not going to last. What ends up happening is the Portuguese founded a colony in Angola, just south of the Kingdom of Congo, and they soon begin to debate over who owns what along the border. To make matters worse, the Portuguese become more and more involved in the slave trade. In fact, the Portuguese are probably the biggest slave traders in the world, but or at least in the New World, by the time we're going to get to the 1600s. So they're getting very involved in it. They want to trade in slaves. It's not that the King of Congo has an issue with slavery. I mean, like most African societies of that day, slavery exists. However, the King of Congo is not going to sell his own people off to the Portuguese to be shipped somewhere overseas. So he resists that. The Portuguese, though, see the large population of the Kingdom of Congo, and they want that population to force into slavery. Now, when we're looking at the King of Congo, and I'm saying large population, let me mention the capital of the kingdom, which by this point has the name El Salvador, or Holy Savior. It has 100,000 people living in it by the time you get to about 1600. That may not sound like a big city, but if you compare that to Europe, it's probably the second biggest city in Europe if it was there. The only one that I know would be bigger would be Constantinople. So we're talking a huge city for its day and time. It's going to be bigger than probably anything in the New World, except maybe the Aztec capital, maybe the Inca capital 100 years before. So it's a huge city, big population. The Portuguese, sadly, they want to exploit that. Well, what ends up happening throughout the 1500s and into the 1600s is relations deteriorate. The Portuguese will secretly smuggle slaves, send their allies or sometimes even themselves in there to go take slaves. And eventually they start encouraging a group called the Jagas or the Imbangalas. And this group is somewhat hard to explain. They're not really a people group. They're more of a society. And according to the sources, they're a society that kind of dedicates itself to evil. Now, you got to take all this stuff with a grain of salt because you can't necessarily trust the sources. Some of this has come from the Portuguese. But the Portuguese encouraged these people to raid into the Kingdom of Congo, bring slaves to the Portuguese, or simply just wreak havoc to destabilize the kingdom. Well, things get to an actual war when we get into 1665. You're going to see a Portuguese army and a Congolese army both march into a disputed territory. They were not looking for a war, but they ran into each other, battle broke out, and a war began. The first battle was devastating to the people of the Congo. The king himself, King Antonio I, was killed in the battle. A huge number of the nobles, the leaders of the Kingdom of Congo, also died in that one battle. The Portuguese then invaded the kingdom proper, and you're going to see a war take place. In the end, the Portuguese lose. The Kingdom of Congo does defeat them, drives them back out, but so many of the leaders of the kingdom have fallen, are now dead, that you don't have centralized leadership, and it falls into civil war for 40 years. Well, for practical purposes, that takes away the barrier to the slave trade for the Portuguese. So by the time you get to the late 1600s into the 1700s, the Portuguese make deals as they see fit, and the slave trade prospers for them. And you're going to see so many people sold into slavery, forced to come to America and elsewhere. And that's why you see those huge numbers that you do. Now, looking at that, that's just part of the story, of course. One thing about slavery is it's a horrible system. You have all this suppression of people, all this forced labor, but people manage to survive anyway. And what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of contributions from these people to the history of the United States. And you can trace these back to particular African regions, which I think is quite fascinating. Now, a disclaimer first. I could probably talk for weeks about this. There are books and books written on this. I can barely scratch the surface. So just understand that I'm barely saying anything tonight. But to talk about just a bit. Now, let me start with one thing that's kind of depressing, but I don't know if anybody has come across the old idea that native-born Africans could fly. Now, that belief was pretty widespread if you get back into the days before the Civil War. And even when you look at the years after the Civil War, people were still talking about this up into the 1930s, 1940s, this idea that native-born Africans could fly. If you go and look in some of the sources from former enslaved people, they will talk about, oh, yes, this person flew. I saw him fly, or I heard about him flying. Well, this is something that scholars have traced down and said, well, it comes from the Igbo people in particular. Now, you might say, okay, how does this belief come into being? Well, it's really not about actual flying. Now, that's the way people came to understand it later. What it refers to is the religious belief among the Igbo people that when you die, your spirit will fly back to Africa and be reborn in a new body. It's a kind of reincarnation concept. What probably happened was you had people die, or in many cases commit suicide. The Igbo people were known for committing suicide, often large groups of 60 people perhaps, when they're forced into slavery, brought to the New World. And the reason is not that they're just saying, I can't take it, I'm giving up. They're saying, I'm going to die because I'm going to be reborn back at home. How do you communicate the disappearance of someone to, for instance, a child, a family they've known? Well, you tell them in the way you understand it spiritually, they've flown back home. That's one thing that comes from a particular group. Now, some of the other things you would see are the languages, words, for instance. The Kikongo language, that's the language of the Congo people of this old kingdom of Congo. And also you have very similar religions in that, similar languages in that same area. It contributes several words. Have you ever heard the word goober? Goober, for instance, for peanut. Goober, you hear that a good bit in Georgia in particular, but that word is Kikongo for peanut. The word cooter for turtle. I've heard that a few times. Cooter is a Kikongo word for turtle. I understand that gumbo is Kikongo for okra. That's why gumbo has okra in it. It's a gumbo soup, but it turns into just gumbo for short. The word banjo, that comes from the Congo region. Now, take it a little broader than that. You might have heard of the Gullah language of South Carolina, a little bit into Georgia. Most people say that's heavily influenced by Congo, by Kikongo. Now, not so many words. There are words from it, but the speech patterns, the way sentences are constructed, is based on Kikongo structure. So you've got that language there even now. Now, other things you would find beyond language, food. Now, you might have noticed if you go down to New Orleans or South Louisiana, you've got a lot of boiled foods. You have a lot of rice-based foods. Interestingly, if you go over to South Carolina and Georgia on the coast, the foods are very similar. Down South Louisiana, we have boiled crawfish. Well, we got them up here in North Louisiana now, but we have boiled crawfish. You put corn, you put potatoes, spices. Well, look over at the South Carolina Low Country, they have low country boil. Very similar, you just use shrimp, but it's a very similar food. Here in Louisiana, we have red beans and rice. You go over to South Carolina, they have Hoppin' John, which is about the same thing, only instead of red beans, you've got black-eyed peas. Go to Senegal today, and you'll notice when people serve you lunch in a village, it's basically red beans and rice, or Hoppin' John. It's that basic same dish. You're seeing that in these two different areas because of that African influence from Senegambia, but they also have some similar dishes elsewhere in Africa, but that's where it's coming from. Coming into these areas, still something we eat frequently. Now, other things that you would have seen historically, you have African names that survived for a long time in the American South. Now, a lot of these names are not names you hear today. In fact, sometimes they're considered pejorative, but they're originally African names, and people preserve them because it's carrying on that tradition in the family. Names like Cujo or Juba, Minda. Even the name Sambo is actually an African name that is in common use in the colonial days into the time before the Civil War, before emancipation. Now, that's not to say they haven't taken on negative connotations today. People have overused them, used them to stereotype, but nonetheless, you have that for quite a while. A few other things that you see that survive into the period well beyond slavery, in fact, belief in certain spiritual things. For example, from the Congo region, you have belief in what are called Simbi. Now, Simbi are water spirits. They are talked about in Georgia. You can find them referenced in old sources like a Simbi living in a well or a Simbi living in a particular river. There's a reference in New Orleans as well to a spirit called Simbe being called upon in 1863. A pro-Northern newspaper in occupied New Orleans talks about it. This belief in spirits is around at least until the Civil War, probably a bit afterward. In fact, at one time, it wasn't uncommon in Georgia, for instance, when someone was going to be baptized into the church, that when people would gather at the river, they would pray to the Simbi first, then they would baptize a person into Christianity. A mixture, a creolization, you could say, of African religion blending with Christianity. Now, in Louisiana, of course, you have voodoo, this religion that is more or less a modified version of what you would have found in Benin. Now, in Benin, it's called Vodun. It is still very widely followed today. About a third of the people in the country follow it. A little bit larger number follow Christianity, and then you have a similar number follow Islam. So you have three main religions, but Vodun is one of them. That religion comes over to Louisiana with slaves, enslaved people from the Bight of Benin. It has multiple different deities that are still referenced at least as late as the 1940s. So you have people who reference what is called in Louisiana Blanc Denis, or in Africa called Don. That's a serpent deity, seen as kind of being in the heavens as kind, benevolent deity who watches over people. You have in Louisiana Papa Leba. Over in Benin, you have Legba, same deity, slightly different names. A god of gateways, markets, things like that. You have numerous others. Now, there are plenty of other things you can talk about as well. Just words like gree-gree. You hear it in South Louisiana? That comes from Senegambia. And you can go on and on with a lot of different survivals, you could say, of Africa that still influence the country today. And one last thing I'll just end on. Everybody probably recognizes the importance of African music in American music in general, but you can see it in the traditional music that you would find in the South. If you ever go back and listen to, say, traditional fiddle music or banjo music or just any of the older types of music, what you'll notice is that one thing that sets it apart from what you'll find elsewhere in the country is that it always has a strong beat. You could march to it pretty much every time. That's not the case with what you find traditional music in the North. The melody is the key in the North. In the South, the melody is important, but the beat is what drives it. That is something that most everybody agrees comes from that African influence that's still continuing to shape how we experience culture in the South and to some extent the nation as a whole. And again, I can say a lot more, but I'll stop right there and we can have some discussion, or I can answer questions or whatever the rest of the session holds.
All right, this is anyone's opportunity to ask a question. You can either type it in the chat, and Miss Sanders and I will make sure that Professor Anderson is able to see it, or you can ask it. I'll just make a comment, Professor Anderson. I'm loving this because I grew up in New Orleans, and so much of the language and the food and the culture is a mixture of the French Creole and the African ancestry. I think of Zydeco music. I'm sure that's some root. I don't know if it's the Congo, but I know that music is rooted in African ancestry. Is that correct?
Well, a lot of it is. Now, when you're talking about like Zydeco, that has a
Right.
lot of Cajun influence as
That's,
well.
yes.
One thing you find like no one really realizes this, but in voodoo in the 1800s, they actually used accordions in ceremonies. And that's not something you necessarily think about as being kind of an African thing. It's not an African instrument, but you have that even there. So, like, there are accounts of Marie Laveau, the famous voodoo priestess. She had an accordion player at her ceremonies, along with drums and other things. But you have that interaction between, really, especially the Cajun population on the outside of the city and the African population. There's a lot of cultural interchange there. And so, a lot of things we might think of as being Cajun were originally African. So
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. That's my point. You know, grow up in New Orleans, we had a lot of course, New Orleans history in school, and there was a lot of interplay between the Cajun and the African American history, and it's fascinating to me of just knowing the origin of the words and the music and the food and where it all came from. So thank you. I'm finding this very interesting and informative. We do have one message in the chat from Jake. He says, "Is it true that Africans can fly?" Like, actually true, just curious. I think you answered that, but go ahead, Professor
yeah,
Anderson.
no, nobody that I'm aware of can actually fly, but that's the religious belief. The idea that when they would die among the Igbo, the belief was their spirits would fly. So they believed that their spirits would fly. That's just the way basically people were communicating what had happened, and really probably trying not to just flat out say, yeah, they killed themselves. This whole family that you knew that you were friends with, they killed themselves yesterday. So what they're doing is they're saying, well, they flew home again. And they're saying it from the standpoint of they believe that. It's not like they're making it up. They believe it, but it's not the way we would understand it. They're talking in a spiritual sense, and we're thinking like their body's flying around, but that's not what they're understanding about it, at least not when it's being communicated by the ones saying it. But as time goes by, it turns into people thinking, oh, flying like a superhero or something, because over time, people who didn't experience what was going on, they don't know, they just know what they heard. So by the late 1800s, when people haven't experienced that and haven't seen it themselves, I mean, heard about it themselves first or second hand, then people forget the roots of it as time goes by.
That makes sense. Jake says, "Oh, I see. I understand now. It's just curious." So thank you for clearing that up for him.
And I'll just add this in too. There were a lot of just beliefs back in, say, the early 1800s that people from Africa had all kinds of special powers. I mean, there were all kinds of stories about, well, Africans can do this that we can't do anymore. Africans can do that we can't do anymore. And it's because, by the time you get to 1860, by the time the Civil War rolls around, you have very, very few, well, maybe 1% of the people who are living in slavery were from Africa. I mean, their parents might have been, or their grandparents might have been, they weren't. But you have the idea that they have special healing powers or special powers to foretell the future, these kind of things, just widely believed.
Okay, and I think you answered that. Jake was following up and saying, "What special powers, like supernatural powers?" But I think you answered that, like ability to heal.
Yeah. I saw his question actually right as I was starting to say it anyway. So, hey,
Okay.
perfect timing.
Right. And is that rooted also, if you could maybe speak to voodoo? I know that was a religion, I guess, for some, but is some of that rooted in the voodoo beliefs as well, as far as the supernatural powers?
Yeah, it is to some extent. Now, voodoo really was a religion. It really had a whole series of gods. It had ceremonies. You had to be initiated into it. And it's, again, you see the same thing going on. I say the same thing. What you would have seen here is a little different. It changes over time. In fact, voodoo back in the 1700s was not the same as it would be in the 1800s in America because the religion itself changes. So what you would see today, it's got a lot of similarities to what was there 200 years ago, but it has a lot of changes. It has a lot of new gods that weren't in the religion 200 years ago, for instance. So yeah, it's a religion, it's a full-fledged religion, but it does have a magical side to it. And this is true, it's true in Africa, but it's true in a lot of religions. We tend to kind of think of things from a modern American post-enlightenment viewpoint where we think of science as being the norm and everything else as being kind of outside the norm. And that's just really not the case. That's a recent development. It's a very American, very European way of looking at things. But most of the time, you don't necessarily say, well, magic is one thing, religion is another. There's a continuum there. There's a link between them. So with voodoo, yes, you have a religion, but yes, they would practice magic as well, or what we would call magic, to influence the gods or to influence the spirits of the dead to help you out. And it's not like they're trying to do evil, which is, again, it's got that kind of reputation. The word has that reputation, but it's just the way you work with the spiritual world in that belief system.
All right, let's see. We have another question from Daryl Hall. He says, Dr. Anderson, were there any kingdoms that rivaled the size and influence of Congo in its time? I was blown away to learn that its capital had 100,000 citizens. I agree. That's astounding. What do you say to that, Professor Anderson?
Well, in its area, really probably not. And again, keep it in context, they did defeat the Portuguese, and the Portuguese were a major power at that time. They weren't what they are today. So they were a strong kingdom. Now, if you look elsewhere in Africa, the Songhai Empire is there towards the later part of the Congo kingdom. The Empire of Old Mali is there earlier on. And so the Empire of Old Mali, the Songhai Empire, they probably were more powerful than the Kingdom of Congo. I don't know that any of them had a capital city that big. I'm not sure, though. I could be wrong on that. But I'm not sure they had a capital city that big, but they were very large and militarily powerful. And in fact, there's a story, and I'd like to tell you the exact year, but one of the emperors of Old Mali, he actually went on a pilgrimage to Mecca because the leaders were Islamic even then. He went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and he took so much gold with him and gave away a whole lot of gold on the route in Egypt, especially, that he actually devalued gold for a while. He created this major inflationary problem for those kingdoms more in the Middle East because he had so much gold and distributed so much gold. So it kind of wrecked the economy by giving money away. So these guys were important and powerful. Now you go up and you look at Europe again, you're also going to have rivals there. You have rivals to it over in Asia. But I mean, we're talking about an important, powerful force here. Now, you also had, elsewhere in Africa that I haven't talked about, you have the kingdom of the Monomotapa in modern day Zimbabwe. It was important. I don't know if it's a rival of the kingdom of Congo, but it was important. Later on, you'd have the Zulu Empire down in southern Africa, which would be very powerful. But it's a few, 100, 200 years off from this.
Any other questions?
I do. I've been I began like a little mixed debate about like the Portuguese versus influence on like Africa, particularly like Vasco da Gama. I just have a question. In your opinion, do you think that Vasco da Gama had a positive or impact on African culture in the beginning of the Atlantic world or Atlantic trade?
Well, I mean, when you talk about Vasco da Gama, and I won't tell you I'm an expert in him specifically, I'm really not. But I will say, if you look at the grand scheme of things, what happens? You've got the benefit of, we have a lot of wealth today that ultimately is caused by people like Vasco da Gama, not just Vasco da Gama, but it's why you have so much wealth, you have so much interconnectedness. It's some of what they do. On the other side of it, though, you've got the whole desire for the spice trade. You've got all that stuff that has the unintended consequence that you're going to have people coming to the New World, which of course we're all benefiting from, but the Native Americans living here didn't. They die off in huge numbers from disease, conquest. You have the slave trade. That it's not that slavery didn't exist. It was widespread in Africa. You had it in the Iberian Peninsula already in Europe. You had it in the Americas for that matter, but it's going to create this international slave trade, this Atlantic slave trade, and you've also got a big slave trade going the other direction to the Middle East, into India. It's going to make that more intense. And you've got something like 20 million, maybe, people who are enslaved and sent westward, probably the same number enslaved and sent eastward during the slave trade. So you're talking maybe 40 million people in this period who are indirectly as a result of people like Vasco da Gama, not him on his own, but a whole bunch of people like him, that unintended consequence rises out of it. So it's kind of hard to tell. I mean, it's one of those things that we today benefit a lot from it. The people, his people, benefited from it in his time, but a lot of other people suffered from it. So I don't know. I hate judging exactly history, because to some extent, people acting in history sometimes are just plain evil. Sometimes they're trying to make money and don't really understand, most of the time don't understand the consequences of what's going to happen. Hindsight's always 2020. So I guess I haven't answered that because I'm not sure I really can.
Anyone
That's
else?
okay, but good response.
Thank you for the question. Does anyone else have any questions? Ms. Brown?
I have a question. I had just some comments.
Sure. Go
I
ahead.
I live in Charleston, South Carolina. So, and I'm friends with a lot of people of Gullah descent or Gullah people, and well, in my family actually. And so it was interesting how, you can compare some parts of Louisiana to some parts of South Carolina along the coast, and how those cultures were able to stay together. They were able to retain so much of their cultures by, after the Civil War, not really mixing with white people. They stayed on the islands and kept their cultures pretty much intact. And so, like, even in our church services, even now, I'm in a church with 4,000 members, and we still do the still African beat when we sing. We still incorporate. It's not in all the songs, but it's still incorporated. And like you talked about the Hop and John and the words that they use that are connected with Senegal and Sierra Leone. But that was because for Charleston, they specifically went and bought enslaved people from the rice growing sections of Africa. So that meant that all the people who lived in that area and were enslaved in that area had come from the same area. So, yeah, it kind of shows the difference between, what happens in one area and what happened in Louisiana, but it's kind of similar and different from Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama.
Yeah, I I have not spent a lot of time in that coastal area of South Carolina, but I did get to spend a few days one time in Beaufort and St. Helena Island, in that area, doing research for my dissertation back when I was in graduate school, and really enjoyed kind of my outsiders little bit of experience in that area, because it was just different. It's different reading a book versus going and talking with people and visiting with people and experiencing it more firsthand. And again, that's not like going to Sapelo Island maybe in Georgia, which I always hoped to do. I used to teach in Georgia, never got a chance to do it, but you can see some of those distinctive aspects of culture there. And I remember reading some older books talking about, say, fishing nets and how fishing nets were made. And a few years ago, I was in Senegal. No, actually, I'm getting it mixed up. I was in Benin, actually, not Senegal, way off in the middle of nowhere, and just came across a guy making a fishing net in the same way I'd read about people doing it in South Carolina back in the 1930s. And I just sat there and watched him for a long time. And he was thinking, this guy's so weird. Who is this guy? Why is he watching me make my fishing net? And so I was actually drawing a picture of the tool he had, because I wanted to remember what it looked like. And he was like, and came over and looked, and he was, he's like, oh, hey, I'm glad you're interested, when he figured out what was going on, what I was doing. And we had a conversation, not directly, but through a translator, talked about it. But it's just really interesting when you can, for me, a lot of it's reading about the history, but I really like it when I've been in different parts of Africa and I've seen that same thing actually being done in person, the stuff I've read about. And it really brings it to life that, yeah, this isn't just something a history guy said. It's true. I mean, you really have this real connection.
Well, they just took their third pilgrimage back to Sierra Leone because of records, the ball records on one of the larger plantations around Charleston. They were able to trace an actual descendant back to the village that they came from, and they had this big homecoming for her. And I mean, she was a young adult, and they brought her back, and all these people were like, we finally got somebody back who was taken away. And so they just had their third trip back. All the basket weavers that still weave just as they were taught back in enslaved time, they took a whole group of the basket weavers back, and they wove baskets together because the patterns are still the same as they were in Charleston as they are over there. So it's been a really, really good, they did a documentary on it, just people being able to see directly back to where you came from.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Yeah, Ms. Brown, I appreciate those comments. Just hearing how the culture is still preserved despite horrific things and the evil of slavery, to know that the people still survived and maintained their culture. And I really appreciate you sharing that. And like I said, growing up in New Orleans, I've experienced a lot of that as well, that through some very difficult, horrific times that the Africans experienced, there's still pockets within the cities where they have preserved their culture. And it's fascinating to me as well to hear the origin of the culture, but to see how even coming across the ocean, how that's still been preserved and how it's been integrated a little bit into other cultures, like Professor Anderson said, the Creole and the Cajun integrated with the African. And in New Orleans, it's such a great melting pot. I think it's what gives the beauty of our culture, the food and the history and the music. And so thank you for letting us know the origins of that or where that came from. I appreciate both of y'all's comments. We do have one message in the chat. Let's see, we're getting some thank yous now. Ms. Arvin says, thank you for these discussions. I agree. I'm continuing learning and appreciate those who know a whole lot more than me being willing to share.
I have a question.
Yes, sir. Mr. Coleman?
Yes, well, I mean, I've learned a lot as well from listening to this. To be honest, I was in the store one day and I saw the Hoppin' Joe Black Eyed Peas. It was in a can, and I think it had some rice or something in there with it. And until just hearing this now, I was under the assumption that this was just another one of those Southern Cajun dishes. So listening to this, realizing that a lot of what are African dishes that we assume are Cajun dishes and how they intertwine. And I tell people all the time that I left here and went to Virginia for one summer, and the people in Virginia knew more about South Louisiana than I did. I was 15 years old, and to be honest with you, at that point, I realized that North and South Louisiana was almost like two different states, like two different worlds. So, but one of the things that I heard, I think Mr. Anderson say earlier that really stuck out to me was, and I wonder if he would maybe talk about this a little bit, if he said that when people often hear Africa, people sometimes forget that it is a continent and think of it as a country. And I think when people think of it as a country, they never get to explore the uniqueness that the different countries inside of that continent that they have. I mean, if you talk about North America, most people realize that Canada and the United States are very different places. But when we think about Africa, when we hear Africa and we think about it as a country, we assume that everything is the same everywhere there. When you talk about it as a continent, then that means different countries got to be quite different. Because, I mean, to be honest, a part of me, when I look at certain places, like the places where Boko Haram and some of those terrorist groups kind of have their own little territory, and they go into school and kidnap 200 girls, and 3 years later, half of them have not been returned. I think to myself, I would be afraid to ever go there because I don't know how stable the continent is. So listening to him talk about it from the perspective of it being, a continent of so many countries, I wonder if he would maybe talk a little bit about some of the the modern diversity that exists in some places there, they're probably more stable than others are right now for people who would like to go there one day.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I've visited a good many places in Africa doing research or going on mission trips or just going just to go. And first off, let me just say one thing that really speaks to me about the influence of Africa in America is that, I've traveled various European countries, I've traveled some places in Asia and in the Middle East, and I always feel really out of place. And I always know, I'm not from here. I'm enjoying it. People are nice to me, but there's so much that doesn't feel right just because it's not what I'm used to. Africa's not like that. I pretty much, when I'm in Africa, I really feel like this is not that different from home. It really does feel more like America in a lot of ways, more like the South, let me say, not America as a whole, but the South. Now, talking about that diversity, you mentioned particularly Boko Haram, and you've also got in Nigeria Fulani herdsmen. I mentioned Fulani before because they were a big part of the slave trade in Senegal. Now, to talk about diversity, in Nigeria, where you have a lot of this kidnapping going on, and you also have Fulani who are sometimes part of Boko Haram, sometimes doing it on their own, they tend to be really hostile. And it's not really a racial thing or a tribal or ethnic thing, it's really more of a religious thing, conflict between Islam and Christianity. In Senegal, it's totally different. The Fulani of Senegal, they were back 300 years ago aggressively trying to suppress other religions, but it's not the case today. In fact, the people I've visited with when I've been in Senegal have been primarily Fulbe people. They're actually very welcoming, very kind. I mentioned the kind of red beans and rice type dish to give you just an illustration of what I mean by how welcoming and how that country is very, very stable. You don't have much political violence. So you have had some riots there recently over politics, but it's quite safe. But when I visited one village one time for the first time, people were just really, really welcoming. They wanted to serve lunch to me and the people who were with me. And so they prepared a lunch for us. And it was, a big bowl. Everybody sits around the bowl and they dip your hands in. There's a certain way that you eat it, certain style of it. I really enjoy it. We had this big, huge bowl full of basically red beans and rice. It was great. And then what we didn't know is every other family in the village, fortunately, there were only, let's see, 5 of them, but every other family also wanted to participate in the hospitality. So we ended up eating 5 lunches, one right after the other, because of just the welcomeness, the kindness of the people there. And we had done our best to eat every last bit of the first one, which is hard because you don't want to be rude, because if you don't eat it, you're indicating you don't like it. So we then had to do that 4 more times, and it was rough. And the last thing they brought was some awesome barbecued chicken. And so we were like, dang, we can't really hold this, but it is so good looking. We have to eat it all. And we did. And it was good. But like, that's one area. Now compare that down to Democratic Republic of the Congo. I've never been there because I tried to go and they wouldn't let me in. It was in such bad shape they wouldn't authorize a visa for me. Ended up going to neighboring Congo though. But like Democratic Republic of the Congo, very unstable, and parts of the country are very dangerous. It was a colony of Belgium for longer than a lot of colonies remained in Africa. It was one of the last ones to really see the Europeans give up and pull out. It was a brutal colony, one of the most brutal, and unfortunately, they had a lot of people groups that didn't like each other put into that one country. You had a lot of civil wars. It's not the place you go to visit just to see the place. Even though it was very influential here, you don't do it. Go right next to it, though, the Republic of Congo, different country. Only word different is democratic versus no democratic. Republic of Congo, very, very safe, very stable. It is a dictatorship, but I was in the capital of Brazzaville, big city, and just because I was doing research during the day, usually it didn't get done till late at night. I would walk down to a restaurant in the middle of a city downtown when I was very clearly a foreigner and saw no crime. No one bothered me. I'd be scared to walk down New York City in the middle of the night. I'd be scared to walk anywhere else. I could do it just fine in Brazzaville. Same thing in Senegal, the capital of Dakar. 4 million people live in Dakar. I walked all over the city all the time. No crime that I could tell. Benin, same way. I didn't walk quite as much around there, but again, there's not crime there. Go to Nairobi, Kenya, all kinds of petty crime. If you walk down the street, you have people try to pick your pockets, that kind of thing. You just have a lot of variety, a lot of different forms of government. They're bunches of places in Africa that if you want to just be a tourist, do your thing, it's not much more difficult than doing it in America. And the difficulty is only that you might not speak the language. You might not know kind of how to get around because the ways people get around are not necessarily the same, but just so much diversity in Africa that we tend to, you hear on the news about, oh, this horrible thing happened in Africa. Well, that's that one place. And that's not happening everywhere. Even in a lot of places where you do hear about something bad happening, that's one part of the country. That's not the whole country. It's like here, you hear about a riot happened here. Well, it's not where I am. It's not been in Monroe. That's somewhere else, perfectly fine here. Same kind of thing in Africa. People just have these stereotypes of it. They don't mean to, but it's kind of what we get from the news. The news gives us simplified versions because they're trying to sell newspapers or TV or commercials or whatever. So they give us what they think we want to hear to some extent. And they take a really big, complicated thing, make it something real small that they then stereotype.
Well, I'm glad you cleared that up because, as I stated, to be honest, I'm curious about it. I mean, I've always wanted to travel, but the perception that you pretty much get on the media, probably since I was a child, whenever you see them speak of Africa, you speak of instability, violence, or extreme poverty. And that, makes a person who want to go there say, well, maybe that's not a place to go. Maybe there's nowhere there to go. So I'm glad you actually cleared that up, that just like America, there are certain places that most of us in our own towns would feel comfortable walking around at night. So I understand exactly what you're saying. Thanks for clearing that up.
Oh, you're welcome.
Anyone else?
Thank you for asking that question, because that's like a big thing. People calling Africa like it's a country. And it's so many countries. So thank you, Dr. Anderson.
Glad to.
You have a lot of fans on here, Dr. Anderson. Miss Brown just expressed that, and Jake says you're awesome.
Well, he's one of my students. He's probably lying. I'm just kidding, Jake. I'm just joking.
Is there extra credit involved here?
There is, yes, but still, the people who are here is not everybody. It's a few people coming in. So I appreciate all my students coming out. So it is nice. And, I'm going to, whether you're doing it just for extra credit or not, I'm going to pretend like you're not and say, hey, I appreciate you being here.
It is great.
Yeah, I know I've talked to a lot of you personally. I know you're good people.
Jake says he's not lying. It is good to have the students on here.
Yeah, I know it's not. I'm joking.
Another good thing that the Africans brought was an extensive knowledge of how to use roots for healing, medicinal purposes, creating things that make people get well. And the other thing was certain groups had extensive knowledge of the stars. Like, the people in the Bible, they were from Africa. The three wise men who could tell what the stars meant. Benjamin Banneker created the first almanac that actually correctly predicted eclipses, tides, when to plant your crops and all of that. And that was based on all of that information that he had learned while he was in Africa.
It's good.
Throw out real quick, and I hate to monopolize things, but talking about the stars, one of the most enjoyable things I ever had the opportunity to do in Africa was I visited this shepherd in his house and in Senegal. He laid a big mat, this big woven mat out, and he and I and various other people kind of all sat on that mat, and we shared a meal, and we spent a good bit of time talking about the stars because he knew various things about looking at the stars. Like, well, if these get kind of shaded down here, that means, and I've wrote it down, I don't remember now, but when they get shaded, that means it's going to rain within the next certain number of days, probably, I think is what it was. And he was asking me about it. I don't know anything about stars, but he told me a bit about it, and it was pretty great.
My dad used to read the stars.
Uh-huh.
He could always predict the weather too.
Yeah, something I have no ability whatsoever to do. Unless it's raining, then I can tell people it's raining.
I have a question. I was reading about, I guess, Christianity and Islam are the two biggest primary religions in Africa. And I think I read somewhere where maybe Islam was around 41%. But as the slave trade was taking place, and the people who came to like Louisiana, were they primarily allowed to keep their religions that they came with, or did they have to just adopt the religion of the slave owners at the time?
Well, it depends a lot on the time you're talking about. Now, in Louisiana specifically, the French and the Spanish, I believe, both required that, and it was really kind of put on the masters, the people who were holding the slaves. They were required to instruct them in Catholicism by law. Now, in reality, what that might often mean is when people are brought over, they're brought off the ship. You might have a priest there. He'll sprinkle water over everybody and say, okay, you're Christians now. And of course, they don't understand. They're not understanding the language because they don't speak French or Spanish. And then they're shipped off to plantations. And most of your plantation owners, they don't really care that much. I mean, they're in it for the money. That's why they're doing this. Doubtless, some do say, hey, the church tells me I've got to do this. The laws tell me I'm going to do this. So I'm going to. But the general consensus is there wasn't much interest in it. And then if you look at the other colonies, the British colonies, in the colonial days, there's very, very little interest in instructing slaves in Christianity. And the reason being is one reason that people justify enslaving people is because they say, well, they are enemies of Christianity. And now they're kind of picking this up from beliefs in like Spain and Portugal, where you have slavery earlier on. And the reason you have it there earlier on is because of the religious wars between Christians and Muslims in Spain and Portugal. Islamic armies had invaded way back in the early Middle Ages, and you had like an 800-year-long war between the Christians who were there and the Muslims who invaded. And that war's not finished until 1492, 700 something years later. And so you have this real hostility there. And so initially, when you're seeing slavery being introduced to the New World, at least European Atlantic slavery, you did have it among various Native American groups too. But when you see that European style slavery introduced, a lot of it is based on the concept of Christians are allowed to enslave non-Christians. Now, I think that's a horrible thing, but that's how people thought about it at that time. When the English start having slavery, and it kind of starts catching on after the 1640s, when you really start seeing people saying, well, hey, maybe we can hold people for life as laborers. They initially aren't really clear what their legal justification for it is. And so there's the question, what if an enslaved person becomes a Christian? Do I have to free them then? And so there's actually a lot of resistance from your English slaveholders for that reason. They're afraid they have to let them go if they convert to Christianity. Now, later on, laws are going to change and say, doesn't matter what the religion is, you can still hold them as slaves. But still, you have this general indifference to it. They don't care up until about 1800. In 1800, you have a lot of big religious revivals all across the country. And at that point, a lot of people everywhere, including slave owners, they say, you know what? We need to go and give people the opportunity to become Christians. And so I haven't seen really a whole lot of force into it. There might be like, hey, you have to attend church with me. But it's more of, we're going to allow missionaries to come on plantations now. Now, that's not to say force didn't happen. It probably did sometimes. But it's more of, we're not going to try to prevent it from happening. We're going to allow it and encourage it now. And so it just really differs by the time period you're looking at and where you're looking at, whose colonies they are.
Thank you. And one last question for me. Could you talk a little bit about I was reading that when the slaves originally came from Africa, about 70% ended up, I think, in Brazil working in sugar fields. And a couple of hundred years later, by almost 1850, before the Civil War started, about at that time, 70% of that same group had made its way to the American South. So what led to that ratio changing in a 200-year period where the migration went from Brazil and South America to the United States and the American South.
Well, that information is not, it doesn't sound like that's quite correct. So whatever that is not really accurate. Now, what you ended up having was you had Brazil was the single biggest importer of enslaved people. So many more people went there than anywhere else. And you had a lot of people go to the islands of the Caribbean being brought into there. North America was a pretty small number because the reason was it was a backwater. It really wasn't making a bunch of money. Even places like South Carolina, that in its day in the colonial period was the most prosperous of your North American colonies, it was unimportant compared to Brazil or Barbados or any number of other places. So you just really didn't have a very big slave trade here. Now, what did end up happening, which is probably whoever wrote that down probably misunderstood what was happening. But what you had was you had a large growth in the population living in North America. Like you have maybe 500,000 to 600,000 total Africans forced into slavery in what is now the United States prior to becoming the United States, most of them, but into that place. By the time you get to like 1860, you've got, make sure I'm getting my numbers right here. There are different estimates. I'm trying to remember the right one. I ought to know this, but I think it's like 4 million to 5 million. And so that's a natural increase in the population. Now, part of what's going on there is in places like Haiti, which was a big, big importer of slaves when it was a French colony, you had people just literally work to death because it was so prosperous down there. You could make so much money off of growing sugar that literally some of these people would import people from Africa. They would work them as hard as they could work them, and just people were dying from exhaustion. Now, not everybody dies that way, but enough people die that way that you do not have a positive growth rate. The population growth is negative. More people are dying every year than are being born. And they just bring in more and more people every year to fill that loss because they can make money to do it. In North America, it's really hard to make money that way. It's just not, you don't have that kind of money changing hands, at least not until later in time. And so you don't often see people being worked to death in North America just because you're going to go broke. It's what it amounts to. I mean, my personal opinion is give people power over somebody else. They're going to do whatever they can that they feel is going to benefit them. And it just doesn't work that way here. So you see this larger growth rate in numbers, but you've also got the fact that a lot of plantation owners want to see children born because that's just a new person they own. That's a big increase in money right there. So that's also encouraged as well. And so you've got just kind of a different culture to some extent, but also a different economy that drives that. So you're not seeing that many people coming from Brazil. Now you do see some come from Haiti and some come from the Caribbean, but not all that many. It does happen, but it's really pretty small numbers. Most of the people who are being brought forcibly into North America are coming either straight from Africa or after just a real quick stopover somewhere in the islands of the Caribbean and then brought over to North America.
You also have to think about at a certain point, the importation of people from Africa was made illegal in the early 1800s. So then they basically turned Virginia and North Carolina, all that area into breeding grounds for breeding babies to be brought westward to fill the labor needs of Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. And the cotton production required, to make the kind of money that they were making with the cotton production required that they had to increase production per enslaved person. So I'm just looking here in the economic status, the cotton production per person increased 130 times from the 1800s to the 1860s. And how did they get this increased production of cotton in Louisiana? It was called the whip. And every day when they would come in from the field, they would have to have picked at least so much cotton. Each person had a quota of cotton that they had to pick. So it was by person, not in general. And when you came in and you weighed in and you didn't meet that quota, you would get a beating. And so with the systems of punishment increased, it was purely the increase in productivity of labor that produced all of that wealth in Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi. And it was purely, it wasn't so much the price of the cotton or textile mill prices. It was purely how much was being produced per person that really created a lot of that wealth.
And Ms. Cleo, I thank you for that point, because that was also what you mentioned about what they call it, since I think part of what I remember the article saying was in South America, when they brought people on, they brought them on as laborers, and because they continued to be able to import slaves when North America banned the importation of slaves. But what ended up happening is the slave owners decided that since the slaves were their properties, they were going to treat them almost the way that people do dogs today, for an example, pit bulls and rare and expensive dogs. And that was one of the reasons that also that they were saying that there was such a heavy number that, and then the kids are supposed to be, the babies to be sold off and put to work and what have you. So I guess, thank you for making that point, is that also contributed to the number increase as opposed to the slaves coming in from Brazil or Africa. Just the mere the fact that within the American South, how they develop a system of their own where there was a lot of forced breeding among slaves to continue to grow their numbers, to keep up with the demand, as you say, for cotton and other productivity.
And they wanted, in the cotton intensive areas, they weren't interested in the babies and the children. They wanted workers. And so they would come and purchase them and bring them across. And there would be these long trains of enslaved people being carried to the West to do the work.
Any other comments or questions? Anyone?
I just like to say the Baptists got to be really big. I mean, we talked about Catholicism, but in Louisiana, Baptist was really big, especially in the northern part. In fact, they had started as soon as 1860 rolled over. They had their first Baptist association statewide, and they were ready to rock and roll.
And I'll add into that, in that time period, like when you're getting up to just before the Civil War, the Baptist church, the various different Baptist churches, you didn't have, well, you had various versions of it, I guess, but Baptists in general were the single largest denomination amongst enslaved people. Now, it wasn't true for the white population. The white population was more Methodist. That was the biggest denomination amongst whites. But enslaved people, Baptist was the really much bigger than any of the others. There were still a lot of Methodists, but a different kind of thing. It's kind of funny to me because I didn't really realize that. And one thing you would see actually on a lot of plantations is the owners of the plantations were not the same denomination as the people they were forcing to work for them. There's actually a story that I came across a few years ago. It was, I think, I'm trying to remember if it was the grandson or son of Martha Washington. And he had a plantation in Virginia. He was a guy who always said he didn't believe in slavery, and he never freed his slaves, at least not in his lifetime. But he basically didn't have them working, but also didn't maintain them. So it was a weird situation where people were living in this abject poverty, and he felt like he was doing a good thing. But he was Anglican, I believe, and he had some people visiting on his plantation, and it was after church one day. He had gone to church. He asked his slaves to come to church with him. Some of them did, but some of the female visitors were out walking around, and they noticed a lot of the enslaved people were heading off in another direction, a big group of them. They're like, "Where are you going?" I'm like, "Well, we're going to church." I'm like, "Well, you just went to church." And said, "Yeah, but we're not Anglican. We're Baptist. We're going to a Baptist church now." So, you have this kind of disjuncture because like nobody realized this. You know, you have this white person who says, well, I own you, but he didn't even understand they're going to a different church. And so you have this kind of disjuncture, this split in the culture that people don't even recognize even at the time.
I've been working on research on race and religion for the last 2 years. And it was interesting how they were being taken to the Anglican church, and which is so, I was about to say stiff, so, you know, form and fashion, you know, everything has a certain order and everything. And when the Baptists showed up and the Baptists had all this freedom, and the enslaved people say, we want to go there and not over there because that is boring. And so, yeah, and then when the Great Awakening came in the late 1700s, and they had those big camp meetings and tent revivals, and people would preach, and people were shouting and falling out, and young children were preaching, and the enslaved people were actually allowed to preach to white people, and it was like, wow, this is big. This is big. God is moving in an extraordinary way. And from then on, the enslaved people they kind of stuck with Methodists and Baptists. Plus, Baptists didn't have a priest. Each entity had their own, each church was independent. And so they could make their own rules and everything. And they liked that. So yeah. Because I was looking at the statistics, in 1900s, there were 8.8 million African Americans, and 2.4 of them were Baptists. That's 29% of all African Americans in the United States were Baptists in 1900, according to Carter G. Woodson's book.
You know, I think I don't know if it was true or not, or if it's just for the on movies, but I would often notice on movies that I would see when they would do slave movies, they would portray it as, because the slaves were very religious people, despite their struggles, that a part of how often they were kept in line and accepted on the plantations that they were on was because they weren't literate, that oftentimes the plantation owners would integrate things that they wanted the slaves to do, such as telling them, if you didn't pick a certain amount of cotton, the Bible requires me to discipline you. Or they would tell them things because they weren't literate, they weren't allowed to learn how to write, but they would play their religion against them and tell them that the Bible was justifying things that clearly was not in the Bible. So, I mean, would anybody, know anything about that from history?
Well, they probably did do that sometimes. I mean, a lot of that is not getting written down. I'd be shocked though if they, of course, you wouldn't be hearing that necessarily every sermon, but yeah, I would imagine it does. And you've got like, I try to remember my verse here. Is it Ephesians, where it's talking about slaves obey your masters, children obey your parents, and people taking that kind of thing and really carrying it further. Like, hey, it's telling me I can do whatever I want to you. And people kind of take it and they expand that out and make it mean whatever they want it to mean, and use that to try to control. There are all kinds of ways that you have people exerting control, and it's one of those systems that even if wasn't anything else wrong with it, which there's plenty wrong with it, but even if you didn't have these built-in things that you were allowed to, like laws that kept people from being able to read, so it wasn't just they didn't let them. Laws said if you taught an enslaved person to read, you could be punished for it. If a slave is caught traveling on the roads without a pass, they can be beaten up or whatever, thrown in jail. All kinds of these restrictions. Even if it wasn't for that, if it was just this guy's in charge, you got to follow them no matter what, you're going to see abuse. It's just, that's what happens. So yeah, it's going to bleed into all kinds of things, and a lot of it not even intentional. People aren't necessarily even thinking what they're doing. They're not thinking, I'm trying to exert control. They just do because it becomes a force of habit. It's like, hey, I so firmly accept that I'm in charge, that I'm superior, that that just is communicated by them in what they do. So it's a sad thing, but oh, the old quote, absolute power, well, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's what you're seeing in play.
Yeah, and they actually had sample sermons that people could preach or should preach, scriptural references that enslavers could use when they talked to the enslaved people. They had there are numerous books from the Baptists, from the Methodists, where preachers, ministers have written about how they were not being allowed to preach the gospel the way that it should have been preached, because the enslavers were in control of what was said on the plantation when they came to preach. There was, and as you know, the Methodists broke up before the Civil War. The Episcopalians, they broke up over slavery. The Southern Baptists and the other Baptists broke up over slavery. So everything about slavery and the rules and the systems of slavery had its basis in Christianity. Christianity, the scripture from Noah saying that that Canaan's son was cursed, was to be the servant to his brothers. That scripture was used early on to become the basis for how slavery was acceptable before God. And so all of those denominations fell out, fought, had all kinds of disturbances. Even the Quakers had disagreements when the evil, I call them evil because some of the most evil slaveholders, the most vicious, were from Barbados. And when the Quaker Barbados enslavers came to the Americas, they brought that very barbaric system of punishing slaves, enslaved people. And so every denomination ended up in this really big fight over what God says. Is it right or is it wrong? And so it was in, like, you know, all of them ended up getting back together later on, maybe in the 30s, the 50s, except the Southern Baptists. They never got back. They never united after slavery. But it was, all those were purely breakups over whether slavery is evil or is it okay.
If I could add one other, a little bit different take on it, because you're right on that. I would say ultimately the thing that's driving people is the money they're making off of this, and they're going to take whatever they can to use to support that. So I would look at, say, the story of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and then the curse of Canaan. I wouldn't see that and saying that justifies slavery at all. But if somebody's saying, man, I'm making a whole bunch of money off of slavery, I'm having a Christian tell me this is not right, well, I'm going to try to find myself some way in the Bible that I can say it's right. So I would tend to treat it more as a rationalization, that people are drawing this rationalization from the Bible, they're imposing on it to argue, oh, me making money this way by oppressing people, that's fine, because I'm going to find some way to make sure the Bible says it's true. So I say it more like that.
That's exactly sums it up. For the love of money, they rationalize evil to cover their own consciences.
All right, we have time maybe for one more question before we have to wrap it up for the evening. And anybody else? One more question or comment?
I guess mine's be a comment.
I am glad that this has definitely happened. I myself am a student that is currently working on an essay for the Atlantic World class I'm taking, and your lecture, Dr. Anderson, has been enlightening.
Glad I could help.
That's good to hear, sir. Thank you. We'll wrap it up tonight. I'd like to thank all of our presenters that we've had for the last 3 times. On March 2nd, Surviving Slavery, the Civil War and Liberation, the presenters were Delisa Harris from ULM and Leah Hersey from ULM. So we want to say a special thank you to them for our first series. And then on March 9th, we had a Renaissance of Art and Literature and the Fight for Equality. Our presenters there were Brian McGowan from Grambling State University, and once again, Jaleesa Harris from ULM. And I understand that I missed that presentation, unfortunately, but I understand it was equally as well. And then tonight, Dr. Anderson, we do thank you for your presentation, African Ancestry, Culture, and Religion, professor at ULM. And it's been very enlightening. Like I said, I always learn a lot, and it makes me realize how much more I have to learn. So I'm so proud to be part of the East Carroll Parish Library, and Ms. Sanders does an excellent job. She and her staff, I see some of them were on and joining us tonight. So we look forward to hopefully being able to bring more programs like this to our community and beyond. So once again, thank you for everyone who has joined us. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. And Ms. Sanders, would you like to have the last word?
If I can unmute. Thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. My allergies are messing up, so that's why you keep seeing me bending over, trying to gather myself. But thank you all so much. This has been a extraordinary program. And speaking with Mrs. Brister on the other day, we were kind of thinking we can continue this on. And when I reached out to Dr. Anderson, he was like, yes, we can do this. So who knows what's going to come out of this. Very exciting. I've been sharing it with the gentleman who actually approved us for the grant, and hoping that we can get something else out of this. As with always, the library is here to serve the community. And our biggest outlook is to offer educational programming and materials, resources to the community. And we've done this with this wonderful program. Thank you all so much, Ms. Emily Todd, our moderator for the first 2 programs, and our assistant or actual host for this evening. Thank you so much. Ms. Donna Kate Hill Todd, she is our evaluator. She's been on every program. Thank you so much. The presenters, once again, thank you guys. Dr. Anderson, couldn't have done this without you. Thank you so much for all your hard work and support. The panelists, when I called every one of them, they were all excited and eager. Thank you all so much for being a part of this. Couldn't have not done this without you all. And for all the attendees, we really appreciate you all. We hope you all really enjoyed this. And please give us some positive responses on the evaluation form. So like I said, maybe something else more positive can come out of this, okay? Thank you all, and thank you, Ms. Brister, for assisting tonight as well. Appreciate your support more than you ever know. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
You're
Thanks,
welcome. Thank you.
Chris, for
Thank
this
you.
opportunity.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining in and supporting. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much.
You're welcome, sister, all the way from Mississippi.
Okay, love you, sister.
Love you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Anderson, great presentation.
Wonderful.
Thanks
I
for
mean,
sharing.
extraordinary. Just
Very
wonderful.
good.
Thank you.
I want to take a look at your book. I was talking with on the chat with, is it Dr. Brown or Miss Brown or?
My Miss Brown.
All right. I was talking with her on the chat, and so I want to take a look at your book. You said it's probably my library. I will say our library at the university is not that great. They have not bought print books for years. Once since I came here, they bought any, but I will be able to get it one way or another. So I'm going to take a look at it.
Okay. Well, I know the public library has copies.
Yes,
Oh, I
yes,
bet
we
the
do.
public library does.
Good night,
Definitely.
everyone. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all so much.
But
Good night.
yeah,
Good night.
it goes all the way
They
back
don't want to leave.
into Reconstruction coming forward.
Enjoying this.
Well,
This is
I'm
great.
looking forward to it. I really like the subject, though. I know I'm an outsider to it, so I always get nervous coming into a group when I don't know everybody. But I really enjoy the subject, like learning about it, even though it's not, I guess I can't lay claim to it being my history. It's American history.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I guess, I don't know. It's fascinating. So much to learn.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
So much to teach.
So I will be in touch with you all. Okay. Thank you all so much.
All right,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye
Have a good
bye.
evening.